Some stories feel less like history and more like trespassing into a place you were never meant to go. In the fall of 1971, in a quiet rural corner of Virginia, a 17-year-old girl named Sarah Mae Whitaker arrived at a small-town hospital under circumstances that baffled everyone who saw her. She was gravely ill. Her pregnancy was unlike anything the doctors had ever encountered. Within hours, they would deliver a child so anatomically impossible that 3 medical professionals walked out of the room. One never practiced again. This was not a case of tragic birth defects alone. It was the result of a deliberate multi-generational family breeding program hidden deep in the Appalachian Mountains. A program that defied natural law and drew the attention of federal agents who would classify the files for half a century. Tonight, we revisit the Whitaker case with its disturbing medical records, its chilling genealogy, and the questions it still leaves behind. If you find yourself pulled into this story, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more deep dive documentaries, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps bring forgotten stories like this back into public memory and ensures they never buried again. The morning of October 13th, 1971 began like any other at Mercy General Hospital, a modest facility serving a scattered rural population in Virginia's Appalachian foothills. Nurses were making their first rounds, the scent of burnt coffee drifting through the hallways when the front doors burst open. A group of grim-faced men and women entered, carrying an unconscious teenage girl on a makeshift stretcher. Her frame was shockingly thin. Her skin stretched so tightly over an enormously swollen belly that the faint blue map of veins was visible, even under the harsh fluorescent lights. The staff would later learn her name, Sarah Mae Whitaker. But in that first moment, all they saw was a patient in the final stages of a mysterious, possibly dangerous pregnancy. Dr. Margaret Powell, the hospital's senior obstetrician, arrived within minutes. She had delivered thousands of babies in her career and thought she had seen every complication imaginable. Yet, there was something about Sarah Mae's condition that stopped her cold. Her pulse was erratic, her breathing shallow, and her abdomen seemed to ripple in strange rhythmic waves, almost as though whatever was inside her was moving with a will of its own. The young woman's eyelids fluttered, revealing irises the color of pale amber, a detail that unsettled Dr. Powell in ways she couldn't explain. Behind the medical urgency, there was another presence in the room, the Whitaker family themselves. They clustered silently in the corner, speaking only in low murmurs to each other in an unfamiliar dialect. Their expressions were not of fear or grief, but of anticipation, as if they were not witnessing a medical emergency, but the long-awaited climax of some ritual. One man, later identified as Sarah Mae's father, locked eyes with Dr. Powell and said softly, "We're here for the culmination." The words sent a chill down her spine, their meaning unclear, but their conviction unmistakable. As the nurses wheeled Sarah Mae toward the delivery suite, the atmosphere in the hospital shifted. The staff could feel the tension, a sense that this was no ordinary case, and that what was about to unfold might carry consequences far beyond the walls of Mercy General. Outside, autumn fog rolled down from the mountains, blanketing the parking lot in pale gray. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed, the fetal monitor beeped, and an unspoken understanding passed between the staff. Whatever this was, it had to be documented carefully, precisely, and without assumption. By the time Sarah Mae was prepped for labor, Dr. Powell had already called in additional staff, sensing she might need every available set of hands. Yet, as the first contractions began, it became clear that medical expertise alone might not be enough. This was not just a birth. It was an event, one that would test the boundaries of medicine, ethics, and the very definition of life. And as the first hours passed, the staff would realize they were no longer simply treating a patient. They were bearing witness to something history was never meant to record. The Whitaker name had been whispered in Roanoke County for generations, often with a mix of suspicion and unease. Their story began in 1847 when a man named Joshua Whitaker claimed 200 acres of unforgiving mountain land, a place so remote that no other settler had wanted it. The soil was rocky, the winters brutal, and the nearest trading post was a grueling 3-day ride away. But Joshua had not come for prosperity. He had come for isolation. With him were 2 women, his legal wife Martha and her younger sister Rebecca. The local preacher, eager for any congregation, blessed both unions, setting the foundation for a family structure that would defy convention and law for more than a century. By 1855, Joshua had fathered 14 children between the 2 sisters, and his vision for the family began to take shape. He preached a philosophy that outsiders would later describe as dangerous, even delusional, that mixing bloodlines weakened what he called the divine essence. In his mind, the Whitakers were chosen, meant to preserve their purity at all costs. This belief took root in the children, shaping their understanding of family, morality, and destiny. When they came of age, they did not look for spouses beyond the mountains. They married each other, folding the family tree back onto itself. The effects of this choice were visible within a generation. Neighbors spoke of Whitaker children who rarely spoke, who walked with awkward gaits, and whose eyes seemed to focus not on the world in front of them, but on something far away. Local doctors began refusing to attend Whitaker births, convinced that the family carried a curse. The Whitakers, however, saw no curse, only progress toward what they believed was a higher state of being. With each new birth, they felt they were moving closer to a perfect circle of genetic purity. By the turn of the 20th century, this pursuit had evolved into something disturbingly systematic. The Whitakers developed a breeding schedule they called the rotation system, in which every fertile woman bore children with multiple male relatives in a carefully planned order. Meticulous records were kept, as though the family were running a livestock program rather than raising human children. The deeper the bloodline folded inward, the more they believed they were fulfilling Joshua's original vision. Outsiders were avoided at all costs, and any attempt to question their practices was met with hostility, sometimes violence. For more than 100 years, the Whitakers lived apart from the world, bound by their own laws and insulated by the mountains that surrounded them. Generations came and went without a single new face entering their family circle. To the rest of Roanoke County, they became a kind of ghost story. The family you didn't visit, the property you didn't cross, the people whose windows you never looked into. But within those mountains, the Whitakers saw themselves not as outcasts, but as guardians of a legacy. And that legacy was about to converge on a frail, unconscious 17-year-old girl lying in a hospital delivery room. What began as sibling unions in the early Whitaker generations eventually hardened into a codified practice, one so structured that it resembled agricultural breeding more than human family life. By the 1920s, the Whitakers had formalized what they called the rotation system. This was no casual arrangement born of necessity and isolation. It was a deliberate schedule written in ledgers and passed from one generation of elders to the next. Each fertile woman was paired with multiple male relatives in a set sequence over the course of her reproductive years. The objective was clear: maximize genetic concentration, maintain what they believed to be a pure bloodline, and avoid any introduction of outside DNA. This system was overseen by the oldest men in the family, who acted as both record keepers and enforcers. Large leather-bound books were stored in a locked chest in the main house, documenting every pairing, every birth, and every death. Notes in the margins tracked the success of certain combinations with chillingly clinical language about physical traits, mental acuity, and purity scores. In their world, children were less the product of love or accident, and more the result of long-term multi-generational planning. The results, as seen by outsiders, were catastrophic. Many children were born with severe congenital defects, missing limbs, cleft palates, or underdeveloped organs. Others survived, but displayed profound developmental delays. Yet the Whitakers interpreted these outcomes differently. Children who died shortly after birth were referred to as offerings to the blood, their deaths accepted as part of the path toward what they believed would eventually be a flawless generation. Those who survived, even with significant impairments, were seen as stepping stones in the family's march toward perfection. The rotation system did more than determine pairings. It created a web of relationships so entangled that conventional family roles became meaningless. A man might be a father, uncle, and cousin to the same child simultaneously. Siblings could also be half-siblings, nieces, or nephews, depending on the rotation year. This erasure of traditional family boundaries was not accidental. It reinforced the idea that the Whitakers were one organism, one entity, and that individuality was secondary to the bloodline. By the time Sarah May was born in the 1950s, the rotation system had been running uninterrupted for decades. She grew up in a household where everyone was both kin and stranger, where bloodlines twisted back on themselves in ways no outsider could easily untangle. To her elders, she was simply another link in a chain, stretching back to Joshua Whitaker's original vision. But to the outside world, and soon to the doctors at Mercy General Hospital, she would become the living embodiment of just how far the Whitaker system had pushed the limits of human biology. To understand the circumstances that brought Sarah May Whitaker into the world, you have to trace her bloodline through a maze of names, dates, and connections that defy conventional family trees. Her grandmother, Charity Whitaker, was born in 1925 as the child of 3 fathers. Her own father, her father's brother, and her mother's brother, all within the same bloodline. When modern geneticists eventually examined her DNA decades later, they found patterns so entangled that they initially believed the samples had been contaminated. Charity's chromosomes told a story that simply wasn't supposed to be biologically possible. She was simultaneously her mother's daughter, niece, and cousin. Charity grew up in the Whitaker homestead, steeped in the family's insular beliefs. From an early age, she was taught that the outside world was full of mongrels who had polluted their own heritage with foreign blood. In her teenage years, she was selected to bear children according to the rotation system. At just 15, she gave birth to her first child, a boy named Thomas. On paper, Thomas was her son. In reality, he was also her nephew, her cousin, and through the tangle of the Whitaker genealogy, her half-brother. Thomas inherited not just the Whitaker physical traits, but also the family's ideology. He grew into a man who saw his role as a custodian of the bloodline, bound to preserve it as his ancestors had. When it came time for him to produce children, the rotation system paired him with multiple women in the family, one of them being Sarah May's mother, who was also his cousin and half-sister. This was not considered unusual in their world. It was in fact the expected course of life. Sarah May was born into this environment in the mid-1950s, surrounded by people who were connected to her in ways that words like uncle, aunt, or grandparent could no longer neatly describe. She grew up hearing the Whitaker dialect, a hybrid of English and archaic phrases unintelligible to outsiders. She also grew up seeing without question the physical and mental toll that generations of inbreeding had inflicted on her relatives. Malformed limbs, developmental delays, and peculiar mannerisms that the family wore with pride rather than shame. By the time she reached adolescence, Sarah May was already marked by the family as high value in the rotation. Her genetic profile, as they saw it, carried a lineage concentrated through the most successful pairings in Whitaker history. The elders believed she had the potential to produce the long-awaited culmination, the perfect expression of their bloodline. It was this belief that would seal her fate and ultimately bring her unconscious and near death to the doors of Mercy General Hospital in October 1971. For Sarah May, the signs began subtly. At first, it was the missed cycle, the queasy mornings, the same patterns she had experienced in her 2 earlier pregnancies. But this time, the changes came faster, more violently. Within weeks, her abdomen began to swell at an alarming rate. The skin stretched thin enough to reveal a dark, sprawling network of veins beneath. By the 7th month, she looked ready to deliver twins. Yet the midwives in the family assured her that the perfect one was simply growing strong. Every kick, every movement was hailed by the elders as a sign that their century-long plan was finally coming to fruition. But Sarah May felt something no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. This pregnancy was different in ways that terrified her. The movements inside her weren't like a baby shifting or stretching. They came in rhythmic pulses, as if the life within her was breathing in patterns of its own. At night, she swore she could feel her entire belly tighten and release in waves like trapped lightning rolling beneath her skin. The elders called it a blessing. Sarah May called it a storm she couldn't escape. Her health declined rapidly. Over the course of 2 months, she lost more than 40 pounds, her once thick hair coming out in handfuls, her teeth loosening in her gums. Most unsettling of all, her eyes began to shift from deep brown to a pale, unnatural yellow, the color catching light in the dim interiors of the Whitaker home. To the family, these were divine signs, proof she was transforming, becoming something more than human. To any medical professional, they were glaring symptoms of severe metabolic distress, a body being poisoned from the inside out by a pregnancy gone dangerously wrong. Despite her failing condition, Sarah May was never taken to a doctor. The Whitakers believed that outside interference could corrupt the process. Instead, they prepared for the birth with the fervor of a religious festival. Rooms were cleared, ceremonial objects brought from storage, and chants rehearsed in their secret dialect. Even as Sarah May slipped into long spells of unconsciousness, they remained convinced that she was carrying not just a child, but the embodiment of the Whitaker destiny, a being they believed would prove their superiority to the corrupted world beyond the mountains. By early October, Sarah May was barely responsive, her breathing shallow, her skin waxy. When she collapsed completely, the family made their first concession to the outside world. They carried her 30 meters down twisting mountain roads to Mercy General Hospital, not out of concern for her survival, but because they wanted the birth witnessed, recorded by modern medicine for history. In their minds, the culmination was about to arrive, and the world needed proof. They could not yet know that the act of stepping beyond the Theo mountains that morning would shatter the secrecy they had guarded for over a century. The delivery began before dawn, the hospital bathed in the sterile glow of fluorescent lights. Dr. Margaret Powell stood at the foot of the bed, her hands steady, but her mind bracing for complications. Sarah May lay unconscious, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. The fetal monitor beside her was already producing readings unlike anything Powell had ever seen. Not the rhythmic thump of a baby's heart, but irregular bursts of activity that resembled brain waves. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances, silently acknowledging that they were venturing into territory no training had prepared them for. For 14 hours, the labor dragged on. Each contraction sent tremors through Sarah May's frail body, violent enough to fracture 2 of her ribs. Attempts to read the baby's position failed. The shapes the sonogram produced were too distorted to interpret. Nurse Patricia Williams later recalled hearing a faint, almost whispered sound coming from Sarah May's womb. A noise so unlike the steady heartbeat of life that it raised the hair on the back of her neck. She wasn't the only one who heard it. Dr. Powell would later admit she had too, though she never recorded it in the medical file. When the child finally emerged, the delivery room fell silent. The infant was breathing, its heart beating, but the form it took defied every principle of human anatomy. Its head was nearly twice the size of a normal newborn's. The thin, translucent skin revealing a brain unlike any in medical literature, divided into multiple independent lobes, each pulsing on its own. The limbs were fused at unnatural angles, fingers arranged in spirals rather than straight lines. And where its feet should have been, there were tiny malformed faces with opening and closing mouths. Most unsettling was the child's primary face, or rather faces. 3 of them overlapping, sharing skin and features in a configuration that gave the impression of constant silent screaming. Dr. Powell, a veteran of over 3,000 deliveries, felt her hands freeze mid-motion. One nurse backed toward the wall. Another quietly left the room, unable to watch. In the corner, the Whitaker family leaned forward in reverent silence, their expressions lit with awe rather than horror. For them, this was no tragedy. It was the arrival of what they called the perfect one. In the chaos that followed, Dr. Powell had to make a choice. Follow the standard protocol for critically deformed newborns, or keep the child alive to study its condition. She chose the latter, not out of hope for survival, but out of a grim scientific curiosity. As the infant was placed in an incubator, its multiple eyes moved independently, tracking different objects in the room, as though it understood far more than its malformed brain should allow. The staff didn't know it yet, but they were beginning the first of 6 days that would blur the lines between medicine, morality, and something far more disturbing. From the first hours after its birth, it was clear the Whitaker child existed in a space that defied normal medical understanding. It did not cry, did not wail, and showed no distress at being separated from its mother. Instead, it produced a constant low hum, a sound that nurses compared to the faint buzz of static electricity. Its multiple eyes scanned the room in different directions, sometimes focusing on objects, other times locking on a single person with what felt like deliberate recognition. To those who cared for it, the sensation was unsettling, as though the infant was observing them, not the other way around. The Whitaker family kept a near constant presence at the incubator. They spoke to the child in their secret dialect, sang slow rhythmic songs that no one in the hospital could understand, and placed strange objects around it. Smooth stones, arranged in patterns, carved pieces of wood, and photographs of other Whitaker children born with severe deformities. They called it the culmination and the perfect one, treating it with a devotion that bordered on worship. Staff members described the family's vigil as both tender and deeply unnerving, a display of love entwined with something ritualistic and opaque. Medically, the child's survival was baffling. Most infants born with such severe anatomical anomalies perish within hours. Yet, this one endured. Its vital signs were unstable but persistent, its breathing oddly rhythmic. Doctors noted that its heartbeat seemed to synchronize with its unusual brainwave-like patterns, an observation they could not explain. Still, every day, the child's condition subtly worsened. Its translucent skin began to darken in irregular patches, as though its internal structures were breaking down. Strangely, these changes appeared to bring it peace. The frantic expressions on its overlapping faces softened. The spiral-fingered hands relaxed. On the 5th night, the nurses found it repositioned in a way that should have been physically impossible given its fused limbs. The small body lay curled in a perfect spiral, each feature aligned in a pattern that several staff members swore resembled ancient symbols they couldn't identify. The Whitaker family reacted with quiet reverence, as though the child had revealed a final sign meant only for them. That night they sang softly until dawn, their voices blending with the hum that still emanated from the incubator. In the early hours of the 6th day, the infant died. There was no sudden crisis, no alarms, no desperate rush of medical staff. Its breathing slowed, the hum faded, and the 3 faces seemed to settle into an almost serene smile. For the hospital staff, the moment was a release from days of unease. For the Whitaker family, it was a sacred passing. None of them could have predicted what would happen next. The arrival of men in dark suits, unmarked cars in the parking lot, and the rapid erasure of every trace that the child had ever existed. The first sign that something unusual was about to happen came less than 2 hours after the child's death. Mercy General's front lot filled with dark sedans that bore no official markings. Men in tailored suits stepped out carrying metal briefcases and moving with a quiet, coordinated purpose. They did not introduce themselves to the hospital receptionist, nor did they sign the visitor log. Instead, they walked directly to the maternity ward, their presence so sudden and commanding that even the most seasoned nurses instinctively stepped aside. Within minutes, the Whitaker family was surrounded, not confronted, but closely observed, as if the visitors already knew exactly who they were dealing with. The men identified themselves only as being from the Centers for Disease Control, though their manner was nothing like the public health inspectors the staff had occasionally encountered. Their questions were brisk and unusually specific, focusing on genetic records, the family's history, and every detail of the 6 days the child had been alive. Dr. Powell quickly realized these were not routine inquiries about a congenital anomaly. These men had come prepared. They knew what they were looking for, and they were determined to leave with all of it. By late afternoon, the removal began. The child's body was placed in a sealed container and carried out without ceremony. All medical records, test results, and photographs were confiscated. Even the carved wooden pieces and stone arrangements the Whitaker family had brought from their home were boxed up and taken away. Staff members who had so much as glanced at the infant were called one by one into a small office, where they signed thick packets of legal documents forbidding them from ever speaking about what they had seen. The official reasoning, they were told, was to protect public health and prevent misinterpretation of incomplete data. The Whitaker family did not protest. If anything, they seemed to accept the intervention with a strange, unspoken understanding. They left as they had arrived, silently, moving in a tight cluster, their expressions unreadable. Some staff members later remarked that it was as if they had expected this outcome all along. The men in suits followed shortly after, taking with them not only every trace of the case, but the very language to describe it. In official hospital records, the event was reduced to a few bland lines. October 19, 1971. Female patient deceased due to complications. Infant expired from multiple congenital anomalies. In the days that followed, the hospital returned to its routine, but the air of unease lingered. Staff whispered in hallways, wondering who those men really were and why they had moved with such urgency. Dr. Powell, bound by her signed agreement, said little. But in private, she began to keep her own hidden notes. She knew the official report would never reflect what she had witnessed, and she suspected the truth would be buried for decades, if not forever. What she didn't yet know was that the truth would in fact be locked away, sealed inside federal archives until its quiet declassification 50 years later. When the files were finally released in 2021, it happened without fanfare. Buried in a routine declassification batch, the Whitaker documents were never mentioned in press releases, never picked up by major news outlets. They might have stayed unnoticed if not for a handful of independent researchers combing through newly available archives. What they found was not a complete record. Many pages were heavily redacted, entire sections blacked out. But what remained painted a picture far stranger and more unsettling than the whispers that had circulated for decades. These weren't just medical case notes. They were part of a coordinated federal investigation into what the documents called multi-generational genetic concentration with anomalous markers. The files confirmed much of what Dr. Powell and the Mercy General staff had suspected in 1971. The Whitaker child's DNA contained sequences that did not match typical human patterns. Sequences so rare and so heavily repeated that some analysts described them as synthetic in appearance. Laboratory notes recorded under secure clearance levels described structures in the child's genetic code that suggested deliberate manipulation, as though the Whitaker bloodline had been steered toward a specific outcome over many generations. this was no accident of isolation. The report implied it was a program intentional and methodical. Perhaps most shocking was the genealogical analysis included in the files. Using confiscated family records, photographs, and the Whitaker's own breeding ledgers, investigators mapped a lineage that followed a precise mathematical rotation. Every pairing, every birth, every death seemed to fit into a repeating pattern. The report noted that such precision would be extraordinary in livestock management, let alone in a human family over more than a century. The conclusion, printed in stark language on the final page of one unredacted section, was chilling. The observed genetic program appears designed to produce a predetermined phenotype with unknown functional intent. The files did not speculate on who might have initiated or overseen such a program. Several references to unknown parties appeared in both genetic and field investigation notes, hinting at forces beyond the Whitaker family itself. What's more, the records mention similar, though less extreme cases found in other remote communities, suggesting the possibility of parallel breeding systems. Whether these were connected to the Whitakers or part of separate experiments was left unanswered, at least in the unredacted pages. The recommendation at the end of the document was simple but ominous: further investigation required. Yet, as the files made clear, that investigation never happened, or if it did, it remains classified. For the researchers who stumbled upon the Whitaker documents in 2021, the implications were staggering. This was not just the story of one isolated family. It hinted at a broader hidden history of deliberate genetic engineering within human populations. And if such a history existed, then Sarah Mae Whitaker's child might not have been the first culmination, only the first to be seen. 50 years after the events at Mercy General, the Whitaker case still stands as one of the most disturbing medical and genealogical mysteries in American history. The declassified files answered some questions, but left many more unresolved. Was the Whitaker bloodline truly the result of deliberate long-term genetic manipulation? If so, who designed it? And for what purpose? No names, no agencies, no organizations were ever linked in the documents. The trail ends in shadows, leaving researchers to wonder if the program ended with Sarah Mae's child, or if it quietly continues, hidden in other remote corners of the country. For the people of Roanoke County, the Whitakers became more legend than history. Locals still claim that their old mountain property remains occupied, even though every official inspection over the past decades has found it abandoned. Some tell of hearing strange singing in the woods on moonless nights. The voice is low and melodic, echoing the chants once heard around the incubator at Mercy General. Whether these are the whispers of memory or proof of the family as survival depends on who you ask. The few surviving hospital staff who were there in 1971 still carry the weight of what they witnessed. Bound by non-disclosure agreements that were never formally lifted, they have lived with the knowledge that the official version of events is a pale shadow of the truth. Dr. Margaret Powell passed away without ever publishing her private notes, and if they exist, no one has found them. Those who remain speak only in fragments, not enough to break their legal obligations, but enough to suggest that the declassified files were far from the whole story. Perhaps the most unsettling element is the pattern hinted at in the government's own report. The possibility that other families in other places might be following similar rotation systems guided by traditions or instructions passed down over generations. If the Whitakers were one node in a hidden network of human genetic experimentation, then Sarah Mae's child was not a tragic anomaly. It was a blueprint. And blueprints, by their very nature, are meant to be replicated. In the end, the Whitaker story is less about a single birth and more about the enduring human instinct to control, to refine, and to play God with the building blocks of life. Whether driven by misguided faith, scientific ambition, or something far darker, the forces behind it remain nameless, faceless, and for now untouchable. What happened in the hills of Appalachia half a century ago may never be fully understood. But somewhere, in places where questions are still answered with silence, the work may still be going on. And that possibility is what lingers long after the last page of the file has been.